Nobody expected the mission to end early. Not the 8,000 men involved, not the reporters waiting back home, not even the admiral who planned it. In the winter of 1946, the United States Navy sent one of the largest military operations ever assembled to a continent with no enemies, no war, and almost no people. 14 ships, 33 aircraft, an aircraft carrier, nearly 4,700 men, all bound for the ice at the bottom of the world. They called it a training exercise. But training exercises do not usually get cut short by 2/3, and they do not usually get followed for the next 80 years by whispers of secret tunnels, hidden bases, and things seen in the sky that no one could explain. This is the real story of Operation High Jump, the true events buried inside it, and the myth that eventually swallowed the facts whole. To understand why a routine-sounding mission became one of the 20th century's most persistent conspiracy theories, you have to understand the man who led the flight operations, Richard Evelyn Byrd. By 1946, Byrd was already a legend. He had claimed to be the first man to fly over the North Pole in 1926, an achievement that earned him the Medal of Honor and a hero's welcome across the country, even though historians and navigators have long debated whether his flight logs actually support the claim. He followed that with a transatlantic flight and then, in 1929, an expedition that made him the first person to fly over the South Pole. New York gave him 3 ticker tape parades. By the time the Second World War ended, Byrd was less a Navy officer than a national symbol, a man whose name alone could justify sending a fleet to the ice. Byrd's earlier Antarctic work had already laid the groundwork for what would come. In 1928, he established a base on the Ross Ice Shelf that he named Little America, and from there his men flew survey routes across a continent that had barely been seen from the air before. He returned in the early 1930s and famously spent months alone at an advanced weather station, an ordeal that nearly killed him when the stove meant to keep him alive slowly poisoned him with carbon monoxide. He survived, but colleagues who knew him said he came back changed, more guarded, more inclined to keep his private observations to himself. That personality, part showman, part obsessive record keeper, is important context for understanding how later stories about him took root so easily. Antarctica itself was entering a strange new chapter in world politics. Unlike every other continent, it had no recognized government, no permanent population, and no settled borders. In the years before and after the war, multiple nations, including Britain, Argentina, Chile, Norway, and the United States, had made competing territorial claims over pieces of it. Nobody knew exactly what resources sat beneath the ice, but everybody suspected something valuable was down there, whether minerals, coal deposits, or simply strategic control of shipping and weather patterns in the Southern Hemisphere. On top of that, the early Cold War was beginning to take shape, and the United States wanted a clear picture of Antarctica's coastline, its usable landing areas, and its strategic value before anyone else got there first. Operation High Jump, officially, was built around exactly this: cold weather training for personnel and equipment, testing how ships and aircraft performed in extreme polar conditions, and mapping as much of the coastline as possible using new aerial photography techniques developed during the war. Those goals were real, and by most accounts the expedition succeeded at them. High Jump mapped roughly 1.5 million square miles of Antarctic territory, an enormous contribution to cartography that stood for decades and, directly fed later, more peaceful scientific research on the continent. But even a straightforward military and scientific mission does not fully explain why the operation carried the manpower and hardware of a small invasion force. An aircraft carrier is not standard equipment for a mapping expedition. Neither are the number of personnel involved, which dwarfed any prior polar mission by a wide margin. Some historians point out that the U.S. military, fresh off a world war, simply had enormous surplus capacity, trained men, functioning ships, aircraft built for combat, and wanted to test all of it somewhere useful and remote. Antarctica was as good a proving ground as any, a place to learn how machines and men held up in cold that no training exercise back home could replicate. Others note that global tensions with the Soviet Union were rising fast, and a visible show of American capability, even in a remote and empty place, sent a message to the rest of the world about what the United States Navy could project and where, and how quickly. Both explanations are plausible, and they are not mutually exclusive. Military planners rarely have only one motive. Then came the part of the story that conspiracy theories still lean on today. The mission ended early. High jump was planned to run 6 to 8 months. It wrapped up in roughly 2. The official reasons given at the time were the ones any military operation might cite: worsening weather conditions, mechanical strain on aircraft and ships not built for such extreme cold, and logistical difficulties in resupplying a fleet that far from home, at the very bottom of the planet, months away from the nearest port. All of these are documented, real challenges that polar operations faced constantly in that era. Aircraft engines seized up in the cold. Ice damaged hulls. Fuel and supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and radio communication with home command was often unreliable at that latitude. None of this was unusual for Antarctic expeditions of the period, which is part of why most historians accept the official explanation without needing anything more dramatic behind it. What kept the story alive for the next 8 decades was not the mission itself, but a single incident on December 3, 1946. An aircraft from the mission, a PBM Mariner nicknamed the George I, crashed into a mountainside during a whiteout, killing 3 crew members. It's a tragic but unremarkable kind of accident in extreme flying conditions, and it's well documented in Navy records, including the names of the men who died. But in the retellings that spread in later decades, this crash and the broader difficulties of the operation were folded together and reshaped into something else entirely. A story about American forces encountering something in Antarctica they were not prepared for, and a mission cut short not by weather, but by an unexplained confrontation with something unidentified. The idea that high jump ended because of an engagement with something unknown does not appear in any official record, any release log, or any credible first-hand account from verified expedition personnel. It largely traces back to decades later, when the story picked up new and much stranger material. The most influential source is something known as the Byrd Antarctic Diary, a document that surfaced long after Byrd's death in 1957, claiming to record his private thoughts during a secret 1947 flight into a hidden land beneath the ice, complete with lush valleys, advanced beings, and warnings about humanity's use of nuclear weapons after Hiroshima. It reads less like a naval officer's field notes, and more like the science fiction that was extremely popular in the era it appeared. Historians and Byrd's own family have identified it as a hoax, inconsistent with his verified writings, his actual flight logs, and the plain physical realities of Antarctic aviation at the time, particularly the fuel range of the aircraft available in 1947. There is no credible evidence that Byrd wrote it, and serious biographers treat it the same way they'd treat any forged historical document: interesting as a cultural artifact, worthless as a source of fact. Alongside the fake diary, other threads got pulled into the same mythology. Stories spread about Nazi Germany establishing a secret base in Antarctica during the war, sometimes called Base 211, supposedly hidden in caves warmed by geothermal activity beneath the ice. This idea draws on a real but far more mundane piece of history. Germany did send an expedition to Antarctica in 1938 and 1939, before the war began, and did claim a small territory they named New Swabia, largely as a strategic and whaling interest tied to Germany's wartime fat and oil supply needs. There is no credible evidence that this expedition became a hidden wartime base, let alone one that survived the war or that Operation High Jump was sent to investigate or destroy. But the combination of a real German expedition, a real large post-war American operation, and the post-war public's hunger for stories about hidden Nazi remnants, fed by genuine post-war hunts for war criminals and technology, created fertile ground for the legend to grow and merge into a single narrative. By the 1990s and 2000s, these separate threads, the early end date, the plane crash, the hoax diary, and the German expedition, had fused online into a single, tidy narrative: that Byrd led American forces into a secret confrontation in Antarctica, that they lost, and that the truth has been suppressed ever since. It's a compelling story. It has the shape of a classic conspiracy, a respected authority figure, a documented but incomplete historical record, and just enough real, verifiable details, the ships, the crash, the early end date, to make the leap into fiction feel more credible than it actually is. It's worth asking why this particular story has had such staying power, because the answer says less about Antarctica and more about how conspiracy theories work in general. High Jump left behind a genuinely unusual set of facts, a massive, expensive military operation that wrapped up far earlier than planned, official explanations that, while plausible, weren't accompanied by much public detail at the time, and a location so remote and inhospitable that almost no one could independently verify anything happening there. That combination, real gaps plus real difficulty of verification, is exactly the kind of space conspiracy narratives thrive in. It's not that people are gullible. It's that a genuine absence of detailed public information will always get filled in by something, and dramatic explanations are simply more memorable and more shareable than the weather was bad and the equipment wasn't built for it. There's also the Byrd factor specifically. He was, by any measure, an extraordinary self-promoter, and some of his most famous achievements, like the North Pole flight, have faced serious and credible scrutiny over the decades. Independent analysis of his 1926 flight logs has raised real doubts about whether his aircraft could have covered the necessary distance in the recorded time, and some contemporaries doubted the claim from the very beginning. None of this means Byrd was involved in any Antarctic conspiracy. If anything, it means the opposite. He was a man skilled at shaping public perception of his own achievements, which made him an unusually good vehicle for other people to later build myths around, whether or not he had anything to do with creating them himself. None of this is to say Antarctica isn't strange. It is one of the most genuinely inhospitable and least explored environments on Earth, still capable of producing real scientific surprises. Subglacial lakes sealed off from the surface for millions of years, unusual magnetic readings near the poles that genuinely do cause compass instruments to behave unpredictably, and ancient ice cores that reveal climate history stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The continent doesn't need invented mysteries. It has plenty of real ones, still being investigated by actual scientists through legitimate, published research funded by multiple countries under the Antarctic Treaty System. What's misleading isn't curiosity about Antarctica. It's presenting fabricated diaries and unverified secondhand rumors as suppressed historical fact, especially when they get attached to real people and real military operations that involved real casualties, like the 3 men who died in that 1946 plane crash and deserve to be remembered accurately rather than as a footnote in a manufactured legend. The honest version of the Operation High Jump story is, in its own way, still a good one. It's a story about post-war military ambition, about a genuine race to understand and claim a mysterious, empty continent before rival powers could, about the real dangers of operating machines and men in one of the most hostile environments on the planet, and about how a single tragic accident and an early, poorly explained end to a mission can, given enough time and enough retelling, transform into something the historical record never actually supports. It's a reminder that the gap between we don't fully know why, and here's an exciting explanation nobody can verify, is where most modern legends are born. So the next time you come across a video or an article claiming to reveal the secret truth about Operation High Jump, with photographs of glowing tunnels or quotes from a diary nobody can authenticate, it's worth asking the same question historians ask about any extraordinary claim. What's the actual source, and can it be checked against anything real? In this case, the checkable parts of the story, the ships, the planes, the crash, the early return, are genuinely fascinating on their own. It's everything added on top of them that doesn't hold up. And maybe that's the more interesting takeaway. The real history didn't need the myth. The myth just made for a better story than the truth, at least until you actually go looking for what the truth was.